All right, let's get on to this. Claressa Shields scored a big win over the weekend. Brian Campbell beating Ivana Habazin. I can never pronounce her name correctly. So this gives Claressa Shields the WBC, WBO junior middleweight titles. It's her third weight class. She becomes the fastest boxer, male or female, in the shortest amount of time to collect belts in 3 different weight classes. Of course, 154 pounds is what this was. Now, this fight was over. Habazin scores her first being knocked down. She took a knee off a body shot, although there should have been maybe a penalty there because Claressa just kept hitting her when she was down. But Claressa scores at her lowest weight. She scores her first ever knockdown. Now, she didn't stop her. There was some debate about whether she would, but Claressa just dominated this woman. There was nothing she had for her past the first round. I won't say it was ugly, but it was, when we got to like the 8th, 9th, and 10th round, I'm thinking to myself, Habazin's corner can call this at any point. So the question is, what should be next for her? Let me tell you how I feel about this, Brian Campbell, because I'm not saying I've done a 180, but I've got a weird feeling I don't know what to do with it. Which is to say, I normally hate these MMA versus boxing crossover fights. Mayweather-McGregor was good for business, but it was a stupid fight. I mean, we had stupid fun. All's well that ends well. But then when Masvidal wanted Canelo, I was like, no, please God.
Couture, Tony, no.
Yeah, I mean, just no, please God. I mean, I love Jorge Masvidal, whatever they're paying him. It's not enough, but I just don't want to see that fight. I want to see Jorge fight other MMA fighters. You know the drill. But if I had to ask the average MMA fan, hell, even the average boxing fan, okay, great win by Claressa. Unbelievable job. She is just a marvel to watch. Who's next? They probably can't name anybody. And if I said, well, what about Amanda Nunes? All the attention perks up. Now, I realize what I'm saying, it goes against everything I believe, but I have to tell you, if you can't name who should be next, if you can't name 2, maybe 3 people who should be next. And I know there was this Jimenez lady who won on DAZN who called her out, but forget it. She is going to get molly-whopped if they ever make that fight.
Like this isn't Layla Ali coming back and challenging her.
Who gives a shit? My point being is, honestly, and I hate to say this, but the most interesting fight I can even think of, not totally, but basically, it's a fight against Amanda Nunes. What are we doing here, Brian Campbell? Save me from myself.
You're right, but there's a way to do it correctly. So here's the deal. I'll always give Claressa Shields so much credit because she's trying from day one to say, you know, whether you like the term GWOAT or not. It's pretty weak term, greatest women of all time. Anyway, she wanted to be the best, and she from a very early time, right? She was already famous from becoming the first double Olympic gold medalist, and right when women were allowed to box in the Olympics, so she had that stardom coming in. And right away, she wanted to be great. 3 titles in different divisions and 10 pro fights. Turned pro at 168, now moving down to 54. She's ready to fight and willing to fight anybody. There's nobody. That's the problem, right? Christina Hammer, there was a story we could build. Hammer had marketability. It was booked correctly. Problem is Shields is just better than anyone around her. There's not parity across the board, right? The parity is that everybody's sort of seemingly below average, and Claressa Shields is legitimately great. You know, she's more athletic, she's stronger, she's quicker than them, and a lot of this stuff about...
And she's mean, too.
And she has the right personality and everything. She could play hero or villain equally, and I've seen her do it. Maybe sometimes she doesn't get the knockouts because women's boxing is still 2-minute rounds and only 10 rounds as opposed to 12, whatever. But there's nobody left. And the idea of her moving down in weight seemed to be her saying, okay, everyone thinks Cecilia Braekhus, the undisputed women's welterweight champion, is the number 1 pound for pound. I'm going to get as close as I can to get down to her. Braekhus is 147 pounds, and maybe we can do a super fight where I take all her belts and I'm the number 1 pound for pound. It doesn't feel like that fight is...
So I had Claressa on my radio show on Tuesday of this past week, and I asked her, can you make 145 for MMA or 147 for boxing, potentially against the fight against Braekhus? She told me she can't. She can't do it.
So here's the deal on that. And by the way, Braekhus is 38 years old. I'm sure, you know, she might be looking to go...
Yeah, distinguished, but...
She might be looking to get someone like a Katie Taylor, someone popular who's in the lower weight class. And that's the problem for Claressa right now. All the names in women's boxing are a little bit lower in those weight classes. But when it comes to making this kind of crossover, and again, I'll give Claressa credit. She showed up at the last UFC pay-per-view card and was doing interviews with everybody. She's putting herself out there. She's sparred with Cyborg in the past. She's done those things. If you're going to do this, though, it can't be... give me 4 months to try to learn takedown defense, and then I'm going in there against the real greatest of all time, Amanda Nunes. I think it has to be almost Holly Holm-like, where you say, okay, I've conquered boxing and there's no one else. Give me a year and a half, 2 years to figure out what type of MMA fighter I possibly could be when you mix in the advantages I'm going to have on the hands and the fact that she's young and a great athlete. There is potential. I mean, I know Holly Holm's a different story because even though she was a long-reigning boxing champion, she had a kickboxing background. It was a little bit easier of a transition, although I don't know if we always give Holly the credit she may deserve for making that transition. I would not want to be like, you're telling me a year from now she faces Nunes and just gets handled on the ground in a minute and a half. Let her actually commit to a full-time transition to UFC. Then you have a story. There's money to be made. There's big fights you can make. I think it would have to come down to what Claressa really wants in terms of her future.
Yeah, so I actually asked her, I was like, let me play cynic for a second, Claressa. We saw what happened when Conor fought Mayweather. It didn't go his way, and I had a few other ones listed where people try to cross over, and it just goes poorly. I'm like, why should any fan believe that your situation will be any different?
But by the way, Floyd was 42 and had been retired for 2 years, right?
Yeah.
Or 40 or whatever. Yeah. Different scenario than we're talking about Amanda Nunes in her absolute prime.
Yeah, Floyd was post-prime at that point. And her answer I thought was kind of interesting, depending on what she decides to do with it, which leads right into your answer, which was, she goes, I'm 24. I have time. And I was like, well, does that mean if you decide to, like, not hanging them up because you'd still be competing, but if you decide to make the move to MMA, you would just maybe spend 4 years doing that? And she didn't quite give me an answer, so I don't know how to answer it, except to say if she does that, she's right. She does have time. You can get these guys who are Olympic wrestlers, and you could say, well, wrestling's a better base to transition over to MMA, and that's fine. But we're talking about women's MMA, which is still in development. If she decides after this to say, I'm going to go train with John Bones Jones, and I'm going to get better at Greg Jackson, I'm going to take a fight at, Fart FC, and then whoever, blah, 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 and then slowly build her way up, right? Because folks forget, Dave Bautista, the pro wrestler, he didn't go jump to the UFC. He fought in some regional podunk, whatever show, but he won. But that's what you're supposed to do.
And he got hit by that truck driver a bunch of times, too, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But this is the point. That's what you're supposed to do. Yeah. That's the buildup. I also say this about CM Punk. It's like, dude, if you really want to get better, if this actually really matters to you as a fighter, you don't need to start in the UFC. You got to start somewhere else way below. So if she commits to that, that to me is an interesting idea. The problem is that does not guarantee you a UFC future.
That's
because you could go down there and you can get absolutely smashed by some jiu-jitsu black belt who just takes you down.
And at the same time, let's talk about weight. She just made the 154-pound limit to win those titles. Outside of Kayla Harrison and PFL, right around that weight class, there's not a ton of options. So you can argue the other point and say, if you're Claressa, you would be doing that for the exposure, MMA is a sport in which they develop women and there's paydays there, right? More than women's boxing. So would be just doing it once, even if you know you're going to lose, worth it for the potential exposure and payday? I don't know. You'd have to be on her side of the fence to really understand that. I don't know if it'd be worth it to your brand to go into a fight you can't win and lose it. Again, when Floyd was 40 and retired, a couple years removed from the sport, Conor had the magic behind him. It was a little bit different of a scenario, even though on the inside, no one really thought Conor could win, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, and is Dana White really going to agree to a contract where even if it was stipulated, where, okay, Claressa, you have to go fight in MMA first. She goes and either gets hammered from mount with elbows or gets her back taken and choked out. That's not good for her brand. You could say, okay, well, they're going to go in a boxing match second. Is Dana White really going to agree to a deal like that? He's never agreed to a deal like that.
If she wanted to moonlight being Claressa, if she wanted to moonlight on the side, go somewhere like Heather Hardy made the jump to Bellator and had a couple fights. Do something where the matchmaking can be set up to really give you a showcase to see if you can do this. And take your time to build to that. It could be something, only 24 years old, like you said. I don't want to see her in some one-off with no time and experience against the best of all time.
What she lacks is a worthy adversary, is really the problem that she's up against. She's so good, she's too good for who's around her, to the point where she now has to look at other sports because there's no opportunity for her. And as you pointed out, Floyd, 42, Claressa Shields, 24. It's a bit of a tough nut to crack. So we'll have to see what happens.